Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. I'm Thomas Jockin. I hope you're all having a great week. I'm actually recording from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania this week. I'm here for some business trips, but gotta make some time to talk about some fonts. So here we are, and let's get started. So I figured this time we've been doing a lot of kind of display or very grand, like very exuberant kind of design projects that talk about for Fontribute. I think it'd be an interesting discussion to review text faces designed specifically for text. And I think that would be, there's more nuances to be discussed, a much more higher discernment ability is required to assess what's different between the projects. But I think a format like Fontribute will still be beneficial for you to gain a better understanding of typeface design and the projects and process what we do when we're making fonts. So I have here Nassim and Chaparral, two text faces to go over. And let's as you can tell, if you're not that well trained in discerning in typeface design, it might be a little challenging to see the differences between these two. But let's proceed forward. So the first note you should see is generally how are the curves and things handled. So we can see in Chaparral, for example, this shoulder over to the length to the joint, the smooth transition. Notice in Nassim there's more abrupt movement between, and a more of a increasing contrast at the joint in Nassim versus Chaparral. We can also see in how the flat serifs are handled. Just notice how the angularity of this form in Nassim handled versus Chaparral's attention to the flat serif. And a big differentiation between the two is their feet serifs, their bottom serifs in this case. We can see that there's a smooth transition on the left side of Nassim and a much more abrupt motion on the right side. And it's more of a directional serif as opposed to kind of a equally distant serif on both sides. You get generally a feeling as if the serifs are longer on the right side than the left side. So this gives us a much more calligraphic feeling impression combined with the other decisions like this sharp direction and the counter shape over here in Nassim, and this abruptness at the joint, versus the more smoothed out approach in Chaparral. The kind of slab serif direction, kind of equally distant in left and right side, and how the contrast is handled in the joint over to the shoulder. We can also note that Nassim is a higher contrast, just looking at the stem weights relative to the joint and the serifs in relation to each other. We can see that Nassim is generally a higher contrast face. Their stems are heavier versus the lighterness or relative equalness compared relative to each other of their joints. Moving to the O, we can see again what we're seeing is Nassim is more of this calligraphic sourcing, and Chaparral is much more abstracted typographically as an approach. Nassim, notice there's a certain stress produced by how the outer counter shape is handled, or contour, with the counter inside the O. It gives this feeling like the outer shape is pushing kind of the furthest out. Imagine it was a clock. Here's 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and we'll say this is 9. So that's probably like, actually that'd be 6, that'd be 6. So we'll say like 8 over here on a clock. Versus in Chaparral, much more direct vertical stress, it's clearly delineated where the thick parts and where the thin parts are. And there's a much more, again, regularized proportion or treatment of the weight distribution in Chaparral versus Nassim. Also notice, again, in the counter of Nassim, how the internal counter is handled. Generally, how contrast is produced, or kind of a stressed angle is produced in typefaces, is normally the outer contour will go in one direction, as I discussed before, basically this 3 o'clock and 8 o'clock idea, while the inner counter is going to be more like their points furthest sticking out will be, in this case, 11 o'clock and like 5 o'clock. So think about a clock of hand. It's usually this interplay of the outer contour with the inner contour that creates the contrast, or creates this stress, as we call it, and how the weight is distributed in the typeface. And notice again, versus in Chaparral, it's much more consistent. There's a much more regularized orientation for the outer contour with the inner contour. The difference is its general shape. Notice the outer shape of Chaparral is kind of the squished oval, while the inner contours is more stout, upright, spelt kind of style oval instead. And it's that interplay that creates the weight distribution, where the thick parts are here and the thin parts are here. Going to the A, we can again see kind of the themes we saw from the O and the N being played out. One is the terminal. We can see in Nassim it has a thickening at the end, and this joint, this really sharp abrupt transition from the shoulder over to the terminal. While in Chaparral, over from the shoulder over to the terminal, first of all, one, it doesn't gain any weight. It just it thins out. It doesn't really gain weight. And second, there's a smooth transition between the two areas of the stroke, of the proportion or shape, versus the abrupt transition we see in Nassim. We can also see the same thing in the inner counter of the bowl over here. Notice there's abrupt motion over here versus the smoothness in Chaparral. Also, we can see it by the proportion height. Notice how high up where Nassim is versus the lower place where the bowl starts in Chaparral. That might have a lot to do with how the contrast was designed for these typefaces, that Nassim needed to have its bowl drawn higher up than Chaparral in this case. Also notice the more regularized drawing of this terminal, of this kind of terminal bottom area of Chaparral versus Nassim. This is a vocabulary different from the serifs we saw before. The serifs, remember, had this kind of terminal treatment kind of like this. Notice Nassim's A terminal does not handle on the bottom, while Chaparral kind of speaks much more to what we saw in the flag serif of the N in Chaparral. And again, we can see the nature of how contrast is handled, the thickening at the high notes of Nassim relative to the low notes, so the thin parts, compared to, it's much more regularized between the thicks and thins in Chaparral. So the end result of this is that, again, Nassim is most calligraphic, has a certain toothiness because of these decisions, while Chaparral is much more kind of smoothed out, regularized, and balanced in its approach. Onto the G, we can see a couple of things. One is the different approaches on how the loop was handled. Notice that Nassim follows a open loop method strategy versus a closed direction for Chaparral, and that has an effect on where the neck and the spine basically play out. By we see in Nassim, it's allowed to be more abrupt. That decision allows it to be more abrupt and then more quickly move over to the right side, while Chaparral has to be more kind of angled down at a slower pace so that it can link up with the loop more effectively. Also, we can see again the kind of toothiness and the playfulness decision on Nassim. You can see in the ear direction for Nassim versus again this regularized model for the ear for Chaparral. It's more of just a square shape with some tapering to help give some flavor to it. But again, so we see the interplay of the ideas we're talking about and other letters get applied to this design as well. Also take notice the, again, subtle motions where there's a certain momentum, not as extreme in the O as we saw in the O of Nassim versus this G, but it's the same idea where these are similar designs because they're playing, well, not exactly the same interplay of of where the weight are distributed, making on the phases of the clock, using that metaphor. It still relates, and that's how these two designs can speak to each other. Imagine if you put that G next to the O of Nassim, they would relate to each other because the approach of the weight distribution rounds similar. While Chaparral, again, is much more vertical in its nature, and it would seem reasonable to have that next to the O we saw before in Chaparral. The R also continues the methodologies and the approaches we saw. So one note is, Chaparral chooses the method of, normally when you draw an R, the arch, the joint needs to come lower down and more from a lower position start, so that this terminal can be created, the arm can be created, and to minimize this white space area. You want to minimize it as much as possible, so that when it's placed next to another letter, like an N, for example, there's the most space, we're being the most effective possible white space. If an R is too wide in proportion, it'll feel too big, that white space in the bottom area over here, as we're discussing. So Chaparral chose the decision to lower the arch and handle its drawing like that. Nassim chose a different approach. It chose not to drop the arch, but instead create a much more abrupt, kind of jutted feeling. It's almost as if I drew as a skeleton, it's like this, like a shape like that, versus in Chaparral as a skeleton, that. So notice the different approaches handled to deal with the issue of a lowercase r. This is a relatively important part about text spaces. They're trying to maximize the efficientness of their white space for these reasons I pointed out. So again, by doing that strategy for Nassim, it again tries to focus on minimizing this white space as much as possible while maintaining the legibility that it is in R, especially in a text setting, reading setting. And again, in the S, see, I like talking about the S in this case because it brings up an issue in drawing S's. I know when I teach typeface design, my students have a very difficult challenge with the S. It's not surprising because an S is a very complicated form to render really well. And generally, one of the things is once you get the kind of handle of the curves and how to draw it, the real question is, what is the momentum of the letter? Ideally, a good S feels very stable, and you try to control it, and it feels like it's grounded. But different designers have different philosophies about that, kind of how it achieves it. Usually, it means the different aspects of the letter have to counterbalance each other. So in this case, what I mean is, how are the curves here and here handled in the part of the spine, and how the terminals rendered to counterbalance the weight, the energy created by this curve stroke over here. And Nassim, what ends up happening is you kind of have a momentum where the letter is moving this way because of the strength of the energy momentum of this spine over here to over here. And the terminals are there to kind of balance it out, but as counterpoints to try to ground this letter. But every type of designer has different aesthetics and sensibilities of how much momentum they want, and especially in how it relates to other letters. I have to be quite frank, this is a much more subjective instinct about what is reasonable based on how it works in words than any individual letter can discuss. However, while we see this momentum this way, it's interesting because I feel like with the Chaparral S, it's actually a momentum pushing up this way. And again, the reason why is because of how the terminals are handled specifically this top serif, I would definitely say it's handled in a way that pushes to the upper right, and then how the curves are handled. Again, especially this bottom curve over here, it's the way it's drawn and rendered gives us momentum. It's pushing to the upper right. So Nassim's S has this downward momentum, while Chaparral's S has this upward momentum. And this is what I love about typeface design. Is that you can't measure this. This is something completely just based on how the different components played off each other. And it's really actually more, you have to rely a lot of times on the other letters, how they interact with these S's, how they're drawn. And using your sensibility and proofing process to assess, does this create a good word image that feels comfortable to read and doesn't stand out and works well as a dance, as a performance of experience, I would say. Not to get too metaphysical with how typeface design works, but I think these specifically as text faces, because as text faces, they deal with a different kind of criteria of assessment in some ways than display faces. The same fundamentals apply to all the directions, but their specific executions are different. And this is what I mean. It's like this kind of thinking I just shared with you is how a text face would be assessed or discussed based on this idea. So what's the conclusion we can say? We can say that Nassim is a much more toothier, it's a higher contrast, so it's a bolder color. It feels heavier in the page relative to Chaparral. We put similar weights on spec on the same page, but it has a certain toothiness and bite to it that might make sense compared on what other typefaces you're using in a display context that might work well with Nassim. While Chaparral, because of its lower contrast, its more regularized typographic system for how weight is distributed, its vertical contrast, it seemed more appropriate to be used if you were using something like a slab serif for a headline, for example, or even sans serifs, for example. You would see very good pairings in that direction. So even notice the way when we're discussing how you would use these typefaces, they're more supporting characters of what your grandstanding posters or mastheads would have, as opposed to the main show itself. Or you work the other way. You could set your text face first and then say, well, based on these considerations, let's go for a really toothy, fun headline face. So maybe, for example, from the top of my head, Nassim, maybe something like Belly we talked about in previous episodes. Its toothiness and caricature nature, especially in its heavier weights, might play well with each other. While Chaparral, something like maybe like Maple, that sans serif we talked about a couple weeks ago, might be a good pairing for each other for that reason. I say Maple too because if you notice, there's a certain playfulness, a little bit in how softness and how Chaparral's forms are made. They're not really rigid and very strong in their position, but it's very regularized. So Maple also, while sans serif, is very playful in its attitude and how it's drawn. So that's the kind of thinking you can consider when you're picking your typefaces for your projects. I'm Thomas Jockin. This has been Fontribute. I really hope you learned a lot from this week. I'm looking forward to talking to you all next week, and I hope you all have a great time. I'm saying goodbye from Philadelphia. I'm back in New York next week. Take care. Bye.